Hello, and welcome to The Pouch, the podcast that tries to help the average Aussie make sense of their current political environment. I'm Gregg, average Aussie savage.
And I'm Jake, insert joke here, Far Warden. On today's episode, Gregg asks the tough questions.
What happened to Malcolm? We liked him, didn't we? What is the current makeup of the Australian government? And what are the arguments surrounding Queensland being responsible for the Liberals taking the last election? That's when you go, what is the point?
What is the point? Is there? Do I? Yes, what is the point?
No, you say... Go again.
Correct. What is the point of this podcast, Gregg?
Well, I was very interested in Australian politics for a very long time, and then I took a bit of a hiatus, and I started getting interested in American politics and what was happening over there. It was just fascinating, the idea that they had a celebrity as a president, and people voted for him, and that there was obviously this sort of underground swell of people wanting change and wanting it in a direction that didn't really gel with me, but obviously it was happening. So I got a little bit obsessed with what was happening over there, and I think that now it's time to come back, to swim in the waters of Australian politics. And I want some help doing that, Jake. I need some help doing that. I need some help to become more informed about what's happening here, because it maybe didn't seem as interesting as American politics.
And so you called on your old pal Jake for a bit of a life preserver.
So why don't we get into it?
Let's do it.
So, Jake, tell me, what happened to Malcolm? The last I heard, we really liked him. Everyone liked him. He was wonderful. And then all of a sudden, he was just no more.
So about 50% or slightly more than 50% of the Australian population did prefer Malcolm Turnbull as Prime Minister. However, a greater number of Australians essentially were no longer enjoying the policies of Malcolm Turnbull's government. So
was this just based on the polls, or?
The interesting thing there is that he set up that precedent. So, years before when he deposed the then Prime Minister Tony Abbott, he set up that precedent that when times get tough, when the government is in power and is not showing favourably in opinion polls, then that should be a reason to challenge the Prime Minister, the direction, etc., etc. So, as a consequence, while he was more favourable as Prime Minister than Bill Shorten, the decision was made to go for a challenge, to try for a different leadership, to try for a different tact, and he lost that battle.
So we had Julie Bishop, Peter Dutton, Scott Morrison, and in order to get myself interested in the political saga that was happening, I decided to place a bet. So I jumped on Sportsbet. I fired up my Sportsbet account and I put, I think it was like $50 or something down on Julie Bishop, because I was just so confident that she was going to win. Not only did the Liberals decide that it was going to be this sort of, less charismatic individual, Scott Morrison, was going to be the leader of the Liberal Party, then the Australians decided that it was going to be Scott Morrison as well.
That's right. And look, just going back to Malcolm, I mean, he did put through a small amount of fairly progressive things, and essentially that's why he was not so well liked by the Conservative side of his party. One of the major points of contention to essentially the entirety of the Conservative side of his party was the legalisation of same-sex marriage.
And then he fled, didn't he? He went to New York, or he has an apartment in New York or something. He just went and hung out, and then he just sort of tweets little comments every now and again. Is that right?
It's a funny. So he's a exceedingly wealthy gentleman. He was very wealthy before he went into politics. But yes, when he was deposed, he essentially said, "That's it. I'm out of here. Thank you very much," and went over to New York. So his son is a political commentator and lives in New York. So I think he went to stay and spend a little bit of time with him.
So what's happening now then? This is sort of my second question, which is what is the current makeup of the Australian government?
We had an election early on this year, 2019. It was in, I believe, May of this year. And it was essentially billed as the election that Bill could not lose. Yeah, so Bill, he essentially had this unprecedented groundswell of support around him. There was extraordinarily favourable polling for months and months, suggesting, and this, it's like several months. So we're talking 6 months prior to the election actually being called. It was polled that Labor would win. And they, as a consequence, they're thinking, okay, last time we got into power from opposition was when Kevin Rudd had the helm. So, with all of this really positive polling in the Labor Party's favour, they decided, let's come up with 1 billion really favourable policies along those same lines of that last election with Kevin 07. There was environmental policies, there was social policies, and there was also some fiscal policies around the cessation of, or long-term cessation of negative gearing, removal of franking credits, which is a fun little superannuation thing for really rich people. But essentially, with so many policies in this area, it seems that the general public, they rejected the message that Bill Shorten was putting forward, and as a consequence, against all odds, the Liberal National Party, helmed by Scott Morrison, was re-elected into power by a majority of 9 seats in the House of Representatives, which is really where we look to form government.
Yeah, well, it seems like a bit of a misreading from the Labor Party, doesn't it? It seems like that they, like you say, they sort of tried to draw on the success from that Kevin 07 campaign and sort of get a little bit progressive there. But I suppose the Kevin 07 people have grown up, and they now, they now like their houses that they own, and they now like their franking credits, and they now. So it might have been a bit of a misreading, I suppose.
I think it was probably a cacophony of a few things, but the major ones were essentially Bill Shorten failed to sell the message that was, essentially his election platform. He failed to tell people, why they should vote for him, and what they would get out of it. And as a consequence, essentially, they did not feel that having him in power was a positive thing, and decided not to vote for him. That's coupled with the fact that 4 months beforehand, again, I mentioned about 6 months beforehand, it was absolutely resoundingly a win in favour of the Labor Party in just about every poll that existed. But essentially, it did show that there was something significant wrong with public polling and news polling. So, and that will haunt us for years to come. Can we trust polls anymore?
So, who are some of the key players in the sort of newer government now?
Yeah, so there are a few notables. I mentioned Scott Morrison. So he is Prime Minister.
That's good. Yeah, I got that one. I knew about that one. I knew about him.
Well, he's an interesting guy. He's been a minister of the cabinet for, I believe, the last 5 to 10 years. Prior to that, you may recall one of Australia's least loved, both domestically and internationally, Tourism Australia ads, which was "Where the bloody hell are you?" He was the author of that one. Lara Bingle brought Lara Bingle to prominence internationally. But also in the cabinet, the Deputy Prime Minister, someone that very few people know anything about, let alone know what he looks like, is Michael McCormack. He's a gentleman from the Nationals Party. He's the head of the Nationals Party, and due to the coalition that was formed, I believe it was 2006 in Queensland, the amalgamation of the Liberal and National Party. If you are the head of the National Party, you do get to be the Deputy Prime Minister. Yes.
Yeah. And that was Barnaby Joyce before Michael.
It was,
wasn't
yes. Interesting character, Barnaby Joyce. Lots to say about him.
We'll get to him next week,
Indeed,
I think.
Yeah. But a few other notable characters. Josh Frydenberg as Treasurer is an interesting gentleman, very well spoken, very intelligent gentleman. Christian Porter as Attorney General. He recently put forward a new religious discrimination bill, very interesting bill. Talked about this week, actually, the second iteration of it. Matthias Cormann, some people think of him as Arnold Schwarzenegger's little brother. He has that beautiful Austrian accent. He's the finance minister. Maurice Payne, one of the greatest haircuts in the world. She's the head of the Department of Foreign Affairs. Peter Dutton, Home Affairs, Mega Ministry. Greg Dutton in Health. Susan Ley in Environment. In opposition, you want to go through some of the opposition members as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So they were all the ones who currently form the main
the core of the cabinet,
the front bench.
Yes, yep.
Is that right? That is the core of the front bench.
That is absolutely correct. Yeah. Well, there's quite a number of other cabinet or portfolioed ministers in that front bench, but I just chose a few that I like both the look and sound of. But also there is Anthony Albanese. He's he's the lead of the opposition. He succeeded Bill Shorten once everybody's favourite high school principal was deposed after that last leadership. He stood down after the last election. A few other standouts from that party. Penny Wong, Foreign Affairs. She is an absolute standout. Just a highly intelligent, incredibly articulate person. Christina Keneally, Home Affairs and Immigration Department. She was also the former Premier for New South Wales. Tanya Plibersek, she is the Minister or the Shadow Minister for Education. And a few other colourful characters as well from around the Parliament. Senator Jackie Lambie, she's very interesting. She was brought in she was elected as one of Clive Palmer's regional ministry, but very shortly after she left that party and became the head of her own party.
Does that make Jackie Lambie an independent? Is that what an independent is, or is that different?
Technically, so an independent is generally you don't hold any party affiliations.
All right, well, staying on the election, Jake, I know that one of the news items that kept coming up on my Apple News feed was that Queensland was responsible for the landslide election for putting Liberals into government. What are the arguments for and against that viewpoint?
No, it has been said that there are a handful of things that mean a great deal to Queenslanders, and of course I am generalising. We care a lot about jobs. We care a lot about autonomy. It's often stated that it's Queensland versus the rest of the southern and other states. We're fairly religious, actually, right. By weight of electorates. 15 of the 25 most religious electorates are located in Queensland. Many commentators have said along the lines of Queenslanders were terribly galvanised against the Greens because they led a anti-coal convoy up to an area in Queensland. I think it was the electorate of Capricornia, where a new mine site led by an international corporation known as Adani was proposing a new, very, very large coal mine. It's if approved in its full state, and it hasn't been to date, and most likely won't be for some time. It's the full proposal. A smaller proposal has been approved, but in its largest all-encompassing state, it would be the largest coal mine in the southern hemisphere. So it was slated to be extraordinarily large, but a fair number of former Greens politicians, including Bob Brown, who was a former leader of the Greens Party, they led an anti-Adani coal mine convoy into North Queensland.
All right, Jake, well, on that note, I think it's time to ask, where in the world is Pauline Hanson?
destined. So where is she now? I couldn't tell you her exact coordinates. She has been for the last few years a bit of a champion for our farmers. But she very recently she spoke in Parliament. I think it was late last week. She spoke about the plight of men in Australia. She suggested, and you might be happy to hear this. She basically said all men should be congratulated. So, Greg, I just wanted to extend that congratulations to you. Congratulations for being a man.
What did she say we were being? What did she say we were being congratulated for?
Well, just for being men, essentially.
Right.
The message was.
I didn't have a lot to do with it. I didn't have a lot to do with it. Is that her message?
Well,
or is that
it's one of those. It's one of those. She's a bit of a contrarian. So
yeah. Well, one that I caught recently was that she had said she declared herself Indigenous. She declared herself an Indigenous Australian because she was born here as a bit of I presume as a bit of fanfare.
Yeah, she's an interesting person. A lot of people say that she says what people are thinking. I think the Australian Parliament and indeed the Australian broader political system would be sadder if she was not part of the Australian Parliament. She's an entertaining character.
How did she go in the last election? How did she go in the federal election?
So she's a senator now, and she was senatorial elections happen every 6 years, and generally they happen at alternation. Half of the Australian Senate will be put up for re-election at the federal Parliament, and then at the following election, 6 years later, or 3 years later, whatever it is, the next group will go up for election. So she was not up for election. However, her party was, right. And I think there was one other senator that was re-elected, a gentleman by the name of Malcolm Roberts, not a tremendously well-known individual, unless you are from the flat Earth and climate change denial societies.
All right. Well, thanks so much for that, Jake. I think that I certainly feel a lot smarter after our conversation today, and thanks so much for enlightening me and for enlightening our listeners.
Look, it was my pleasure, Greg. It's always good to converse with you and indeed our listeners.
Do I hit stop now?